Hello, this is Pastor Manning, bringing you the Beacon of Hope podcast from Lighthouse Baptist Church at 2032 Cedar Hill Road, Lancaster, Ohio. Thank you for joining us in what is our sixth segment of our series, For Such a Time, episodes in Esther. And today's segment is entitled The Deadly Commandment. So far, we have had 5 of these segments. The first one is the introduction. That would be episode number 158 on the Beacon of Hope podcast series. The segment number 2 was the Queen Removed. That's episode 160. Then segment number 3 of this series is Meeting the People. That's episode number 161. Segment 4 was A Queen is Chosen. That's episode number 164. And then, as mentioned, episode or segment rather, number 5 would be episode 167 in the Beacon of Hope podcast library. Today's segment, of course, is called The Deadly Commandment. To bring you up to speed in case you just started with this one, and you will want to go back and catch up with the others to catch the full import of what's going on. But an evil man named Haman had been exalted to a high place of power, a very high place of power in the government under the king Ahasuerus. Haman hated God's people. He was upset in particular at one Jew by the name of Mordecai. Mordecai is Queen Esther's cousin. Mordecai had raised Esther as if he had been her father. And Mordecai was in the gate of the king. He himself was in a pretty influential position within the kingdom. And when Haman was exalted above all the other princes of the kingdom and such, when Haman would come by, everybody that was in the king's gate was supposed to bow down to him and do reverence to him. Mordecai, being a Jew, would not do that. The other people around him in the gate had said, "Why aren't you doing this? Why won't you bow down?" And he'd explained to him he was a Jew. He couldn't do this. And so they told Haman, the other people that were there with Mordecai told Haman, "Hey, this fellow won't bow down to you because he's a Jew." And Haman became so furious at what Mordecai would not do, which was bow down to him, that he went to the king and Haman didn't just want to get at Mordecai, but he wanted to wipe out all the Jews. And so he went to the king and he told the king, he said, "There's a people in your kingdom and they're not like anybody else." Well, God's people are never supposed to be like everybody else. We're not supposed to be like everybody else in all aspects. We're supposed to be a peculiar people. And the Jewish people were. And Haman says they have different laws. They have different ways of doing it. They don't fit in. They don't go along with the crowd. And you know what? It's not profitable for them to be in your kingdom. And yet they were some very profitable servants of the king. And the king just says, "Really?" He says, they're bad for you. He says, "I'll tell you what," he says, "I'll bring money into the king's treasury if you just give me the authority to exterminate these people." Think about that. To completely wipe out a whole people group within this massive kingdom. I'm talking a kingdom of 2,100,000 square miles. And he says, "We'll just wipe out this whole people group." And the king very dismissively says, "Go ahead, do what you need to do." He takes his ring, which allows the bearer thereof to sign and seal things with the king's authority attached to it. He gives his ring to Haman and basically says, "Do what you want to do with these people." Well, that's what was going on. And here we are in Esther chapter 3. Beginning in verse 12, we pick up right after that ring has been given to Haman. And Haman, this evil man who hates God's people, wants to exterminate the Jews. Exactly, by the way, as Hitler wanted to do much, much later in history. Hitler called it the final solution. Haman wanted to do the same thing. You're going to see some real parallels here because the same spirit's behind it. I mean, historically, you're going to see a repetition because the same spirit's behind it. It's the spirit of Antichrist. It's the spirit of Satan. And so what ends up happening here, Haman has now the king's authority, and he's going to set out to wipe out these Jewish people. And so it begins in verse 12. It says, "Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month." Now you have to think. You don't have electricity. You don't have electronic things. You don't have any way of writing things. I mean, you don't have printing presses. You don't have anything like that. You have scribes. You have people who spend their entire life, their entire career is spent writing and rewriting and copying things. So they're all called in. Why? Because a proclamation is going to go out to a kingdom that has 127 different provinces covering a very large geographical area, a lot of different languages, dialects of those languages, ethnicities reside in this kingdom. And what they're going to do here, what Haman's going to make sure happens, is going to make sure everybody gets the notice on this. Why? Because the Jews have been dispersed abroad because of their disobedience to God, and they'd been dispersed abroad, and they are throughout all these different regions of the kingdom. So we pick it up again in verse 12. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month. And there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors that were over every province and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus, was it written and sealed with the king's ring. In other words, this is a done deal. And the letters were sent by post. Now, you think that's what it sounds like. We have post office, and it goes back, well, it predates this, but it goes back to this time that they were going to send things out. Maybe they had couriers that would go forth on animals. Maybe you think about in our country when there was a thing called the Pony Express, and you can think about things going by stagecoach, things going by primitive methods. They had different ways for people to go out, and there was a system of post, a system to make sure a message got out through this massive kingdom in the least amount of time possible. And that's what this is talking about. And the letters were sent by post into the king's provinces. Now listen what the letter is. Here's the command, and it's got the king's authority behind it. To destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. They want to wipe them all out in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. So the people are going to be turned loose on them. Jews have historically had a good part of their population have been good at business. They've been good at making money. It goes back to the Abrahamic covenant and such. But people could look at them and say, you know what, you go in there, you do whatever you want to them, and we're going to kill these people, and you can have anything that's in their house. You can have anything that they have there. You see all their nice stuff? You see them? Well, we're going to take it from them, and we have the government sanction. In other words, ain't nobody going to stop you. It's kind of like the looters and the rioters we're allowed to do in our country, where there's no repercussions. You can just go in, take whatever you want, bust down. Only a particular people, a particular ethnicity, these Jewish people, were being targeted for this kind of behavior. That they could go in and take whatever they want and destroy whatever they had. Something like that happened in not that long ago history. On the day and following into the next day of November 9th and 10th of 1938, November 9th through November 10th of 1938, there was something which was called Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night. If you will, the translation comes over, and it means the night of the broken glass. What that was a horrible, dark time in German history, when the brown shirts and those underneath Hitler's authority, his thugs, who were supposed to be part of the government by that time, they were turned loose on the Jewish people in Germany. The synagogues were burned. Stores were broken into. It got its name Crystal Night because of the broken glass from the windows of the stores and the windows of the houses, the synagogues, as it was across the street. And there was no one there to stop it because the government was behind it. People were allowed to drag Jews out into the street and do unspeakable things to them and beat them and kill them and take whatever they wanted, and that was considered okay. That happened on November 9th and 10th of 1938. It is exactly the same thing that had happened back in the book of Esther. Oh, by the way, just as a side historical note, that same year, 1938, That was the very year that Time magazine had on its cover Adolf Hitler as their man of the year. That's what they used to call it. Now, they're all good and politically correct and call it person of the year. But back then it was called man of the year. And the man of the year in 1938, the year that the forces were let loose on the Jews in Germany, and the year before Hitler invaded Poland and began World War II, Time magazine so adored this bloodthirsty tyrant that they called him Man of the Year. Time magazine. Think about that, as in Time and Newsweek. So when you're listening to media today, like Time magazine, Time, Newsweek, that group and the groups affiliated with them, they've not changed at all. They've always liked socialist, bloodthirsty tyrants. Just a historical note for those who actually pay attention to history. And so Haman said, by virtue of the power of the king, that they could do all this to the Jews. And then verse 14, it says this, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. In other words, you get ready, you get prepared to attack these people. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. There were people who very much were not for this. Other people thought it was a great idea. It caused great confusion. And in the midst of all this, with an entire people group getting ready to be absolutely destroyed, the king and Haman sat down to drink. What a despicable and horrible picture that is. What an evil commandment that went out at that time. This was real. This actually happened. This happened again in 1938. And you give this spirit and these people a chance, it will happen again. And so what happens is this horrible, deadly commandment went out with that. Well, that's all for this episode. Don't miss the next one, which will be the reaction of the condemned, the reaction of those against whom this is published. You want to be prepared for that. Go to Esther chapter 4 and read verses 1 through 9. So the next episode will be the reaction of the condemned. God bless you, and may you have a blessed day.